love one another, because love is of God. Those who do not love have known nothing of God, for God is love. Let us love one another, because love is of God. So I hope Halloween went well for everybody. Yes? Did you get enough candy to make you sick? I know I did. I like Halloween, and I like any holiday with rituals, which of course is all holidays. And the great thing about Halloween is that the list is very basic. It's a very short list. First, sometime before the big day, we carve the pumpkins. And then if you're a member of this church, you bring them up and you put them on the wall on the day before Halloween. And then on Halloween night, we put on our costumes and we go trick-or-treating. Or we stay home and we welcome trick-or-treaters. It's as basic as that. But on one Halloween in my childhood, it seemed like this simple formula was being turned upside down. It was one of the years during elementary school when my parents had gotten really excited and I wore a scarecrow costume. How many of you ever worn a scarecrow costume? All right, there we go. So you know what I'm about to say. It's basically my dad's work clothes filled with hay and newspaper until I couldn't move. And they had to lift me into the back of our VW microbus. Now that was fine. Still one of my favorite costumes, and obviously I still remember it. But it was also the year that we decided, and when I say we here, I mean our parents and our teachers decided that all the kids in the town would attend our first ever haunted house located at our school. Now I was a little bit nervous about this. I don't like being gratuitously scared. And to this day, I try to avoid those sorts of situations. So it was with some trepidation that I entered the school with my friends that Halloween night. And I immediately found myself standing in my old kindergarten classroom. I was standing in my old kindergarten classroom, and it was dominated that night, but not during the day, during kindergarten class, I'll tell you. It was dominated that night by a large open casket. Now, the casket, of course, was occupied. It was occupied by what appeared to be a vampire. And as we got closer to it, because we knew that's what we were supposed to do, as we got closer to it, we noticed that this vampire looked strikingly similar to my gym teacher. If my gym teacher wore something other than 80s shorts and white tube socks. So by the time my gym teacher actually opened his eyes to jump scare us from the coffin, the spell was broken. The elementary school haunted house, it turns out, was going to be a little more silly than scary. Still not sure what their intent was, but we laughed and we screamed, and then we spent for the next hour or so being startled by teachers and parents, and then we were given candy, and then we bobbed for apples in the gymnasium where some 10 years later I would cast my first vote. What I learned, of course, was that Halloween lesson. That Halloween lesson that most monsters are not scary when you are surrounded by friends and family. And when we can remember the words of the 20th century universalist, John Wood, where I stand, wherever I stand, I am on holy ground. Wherever I stand, I am on holy ground. But, there's always a but in these sermons. Here's the thing. Even as kids, we knew why we were at the haunted house that year of all years. You see, this was the 1980s in Maine, and my small town was in the midst of the Great Candy Scare. Now, some of you may actually remember the Great Candy Scare. Things like candy scares, along with the idea that Dungeons and Dragons was a gateway to Satanism are why the moody nostalgia of Stranger Things is so popular. These scares were so common and so generally believed by adults that on Halloween in 1983, Abigail Van Buren, of all people, in her syndicated Dear Abby column, wanted to remind people that on Halloween, as she said, somebody's child will become violently ill or die after eating poison candy or an apple containing a razor blade. Now, last week we were talking about how a shrinking world can make us afraid. And in my town, in the year of our group candy scare, as we worked up to Halloween night, everyone from every age had a story about bad candy, laced with poison, or some drug like cocaine or heroin, both of which are actually much more plentiful today, and apples somehow filled with hidden razor blades, and stranger danger, and irresponsible or potentially homicidal drivers out at night. Our parents were afraid, and we knew it. And in some sense, we knew that these fears of shadowy figures hell-bent on destroying the families of my small town, were really fears of the outside world in a moment of anxiety, a moment of change. In the Reagan era in my town, adults feared for their jobs. They feared for their relationships. They feared the encroaching suburbs filled with people from Massachusetts. Fortunately, that was a false fear. They never got to us. They feared the possibility of nuclear annihilation. And so, like most human beings in moments like that, they feared the other. They feared, and in many cases, they were encouraged to fear what they did not know. And as kids, we were anxious anyway. So together, we all let our imaginations run wild on Halloween. Now you see, one of the basic tenets of universalism is that the hells we experience are here among us. You may have gotten that from some of the readings. They are solely on this plane. Our hells are not magical, and the God that is love does not make them. We create these hells with our own human failings, our ambition, our arrogance, our ignorance. We create them. We create them for ourselves, and we create them for each other. And they are evil, and they are real. That Halloween, it felt like hell was very close, literally just one bad apple away. And our community, in its own fumbling way, was trying to protect us by forcing us to go to that ridiculous haunted house at our school, rather than out into the streets where we kids lived every other day of the year. And we often do things like this. All of us do things like this. There are monsters inside that haunt us. Both as children and as adults, we are haunted. We carry burdens, some of our own making and others that were made for us or even inherited. We carry around the shadow of economic anxiety. We carry around memories of embarrassment, literally our worst moments of failed or challenged relationships. We carry around traumas and addictions, both ours and others, illnesses, physical, mental, emotional, and spiritual. There are monkeys on our backs that ride us every single day. And there is always that risk of randomness, of crises and tragedies that cannot be foreseen. So as we have talked about repeatedly this fall, when we live in these places of darkness, as we often do, the walls go up. We retreat into ourselves, our families, and our tribes. We react to the world with fear. Now the challenge The challenge, according to our tradition, doesn't change. The road might get rougher, or it might get straighter. But always it is about pushing back against the haunted, finding ways to be more genuinely ourselves, dropping our burdens and lightening the burdens of others so that they too can live their lives as authentically as they can. Widening the circle of our tribe until it hits the limits, if there are any limits, of the whole of creation. Now, Henry Clay Ledyard is a Universalist preacher a couple of generations older than John Wood. Henry Clay Ledyard tells us in our reading that our first mission as Universalists to controvert the one-time prevalent idea of an endless hell has, he said, practically been accomplished. But, he says, the second and the more important one awaits fulfillment. A fight which shall continue until the real, actual hells before our very eyes are destroyed. In dark times, we may feel like we cannot beat back the hells we make, but I believe we can. For even as we are in the midst of our haunting, we are not abandoned. In the midst of our haunting, we are not abandoned because we carry that spark of divine love within us. We are always capable of love. Our reading from the first epistle of John tells us that we love because God first loved us. We carry that with us. And again, from that same epistle, perfect love casts out fear. Perfect love casts out fear. The path of faith involves accepting this fact. The fact that we love and we are loved in return, regardless of who we are. That love, said George de Benville, way back in the 18th century, that love must be based upon mutual respect for the differences in color and language and worship, even as we accept with gratitude the differences that tend to unite the male and the female of all species. We do not, he says, find those differences obstacles to love. So here's the thing. After the haunted house, no one went home. We went door to door, like we usually did. The adults were hovering a little bit closer than usual, and they disposed of all the baked goods from the grandmothers. If you're under the age of 30, you don't even know about baked goods at Halloween, but it was a thing. They disposed of all the baked goods from the grandmothers, and my guess is they ate them themselves. And then they checked all the apples for razor blades, and all the candy bars for punctures, and they covered us in that new miracle invention known as the glow stick. But they still let us go to the stranger's door. They let us go because somewhere along the way, even in the midst of their haunted house planning committees, they somehow realized that fear must not win, even or especially on Halloween. Nor can it win today. Nor can it win today. So as we gather now before our communion, let us remember those words from John that God is love, and those who abide in love abide in God, and God in them. Amen.